I want to thank very much, especially Deborah Thakur and Benjamin Zachariah for their invitation to me. And the first thing I'd like to say is I actually feel a little bit of a fraud being invited to do a sort of keynote, because I think this is more to do with my advanced years, pushing 80, than any intrinsic merit in my actual theory of fascism. I'd like to make it clear that, like all isms and contested terms in the human sciences, there is no such thing as a true definition, and even authoritative definitions are pretty suspect. And so even though my definition that I first evolved and presented in 1991 now in The Nature of Fascism has been influential, it doesn't give me any authority to tell other people about what fascism is, or to start a coherent critique of the theory of fascism or the definition of fascism or the preconceptions about fascism that inform the other talks in this conference. I, for the sake of my students, talked about the Babel effect of the, I think there's a Latin phrase, tot homines, tot opiniones, there are as many opinions as people, and I am just one voice in a crowd. So nevertheless, I will obviously be trying to apply my approach to fascism to address this issue of other people's fascisms. For those not familiar with my own approach, I find it really quite surreal and quite black comic really, like something out of Black Mirror, the brilliant British TV series on Netflix, to look myself up on ChatGPT or whatever it's called and see what my theory is. What's interesting about this, if you just look me up in Chrome, and it uses AI to generate its initial thoughts, as it were, if you can talk about thoughts, it talks about palingenetic ultranationalism is the central concept formulated by me that defines fascism as a political ideology whose mythic core is a national rebirth. Now, actually, I'm putting in there revolutionary national rebirth. That's going to be very important when we talk about the distinction between fascism and populism, right-wing populism, combined with extreme ultranationalism. Well, that's elided another important ingredient of my approach, which is crucial to this attempt to lay out some schemes of thinking, Gedankenschemen or whatever they're called. Populist ultranationalism. This is not elitist ultranationalism. This is an ultranationalism that seeks to mobilize. It's a mobilizing myth, seeking to enlist the power of the masses, even if it's originally driven by an elite. This ideology involves a radical break from liberalism and modernity, characterized by an intense devotion to the nation and its perceived historical greatness, an emphasis on a charismatic leader. Now, I should have made that yellow. In the interwar period, this was not defining, but a recurrent feature of fascism, a charismatic leader, and a belief in achieving a new national community through revolutionary methods. So the revolutionary comes in there. So that's my starting point to addressing this question. But again, coming back to my initial point, why I really shouldn't be here as giving some sort of keynote if it implies some sort of authority, is that my theory is only one of many theories, and it's to be judged not by its intrinsic truth, but by its heuristic value. This is obviously shows the influence of Max Weber on me for his theories of the formation of generic concepts in the human sciences. I could never really cope with post-structuralist or Heideggerian or other types of hermeneutic, so I'm a bit primitive when it comes to theory. But it's quite interesting. I was sent by a friend a link to a guy called Charles McBride, who's one of these people that, like Martians to me, they're called influencers. And he does this rather dogmatic, well-meant, and partly correct, in my view, piece to his that's a Freudian slip, Instagram followers, about the fact that we should be very careful about defining people as fascist. But the trouble is, he trots out my theory as if it's somehow true, which of course it is not. So, however flattering, let's distance ourselves from the idea that you can't talk about fascists, or to parody the famous phrase about you cannot talk about fascism without talking about capitalism, the Horkheimer dictum. It would be a travesty if I was to say you can't talk about fascism without talking about Roger Griffin, because that would be sheer egomania. So let's now start what I'm meant to be talking about with some other fascisms. This is some other people's fascisms, but some of these people are actually fascists. And of course, what's happened since the war is that 1945 war, of course, I keep adding and reminding ourselves of a lot of other wars, to mainly European or Middle Eastern wars going on as I speak, tragically. But the aftermath, the fascism did not die in 1945. It went through very significant permutations to stay alive, and one of them, if we're going to call it neo-fascism, because it really is new, it's not inter-war, is the form which I called in my first book universal fascism, universal Nazism, which is where Nazism ceases to be the political myth of a particular German movement with a German imperialist idea of a new era led by Germany, hegemonic German Nazi values, Aryan values, and imposed on Europe. The paradox of universal Nazism is that you can actually bottom left be a Mongol Nazi or an American Nazi top left, or a Greek Nazi in a modified way in the Golden Dawn, or a terrorist Nazi as in the Brenton Tarrant attack in New Zealand, which invoked Himmler directly and used the black sun as its logo, or you can be a sort of modern militant Nazi as in the 1980s, 1990s Blood and Honor group influenced by Nazism. But you have moved away from some of the central emphasis of interwar Nazism on the primacy of your particular nation. I mean, you still give a lot of importance to your own nation, but you actually see yourself as part of a universal stand against the enemies of humanity, communism, liberalism, Judaism, Islam, or whatever. And at the theoretical level, a lot of development since 1945 to create other people's fascisms, other fascisms. I mean, there's a few there. The term Lara's Imperium, the Yorkie Parker text, the critical analysis of manifestos of right-wing terrorists. Francis Yorkie, by the way, that was. Francis Yorkie wrote The Imperium, major figure, subject of a fantastic book called Dreamers of the Day by Kevin Gruden. An analysis of far-right terrorist manifestos is a wonderful case study in that book, and there's Brenton Tarrant's front piece of his manifesto on the front cover. There it is, bottom left, the Great Replacement, Islamophobic myth, all of which are different permutations, post-war permutations of interwar fascism. And bottom right is a very important new development with other people's fascisms, which is the role of social media and virtual websites where people can access an enormous amount of far-right material without actually even having a uniform or belonging to a group, let alone appearing in public. And one brand of neo-fascist development that I really would keep stressing, though it often gets lost in the debate, is in terms of other people's fascisms, other fascist fascisms, is the development of a very powerful new intellectual ideological tradition in what's called the New Right, which has, by definition, different national permutations. Neue Rechte, there's a Russian one pioneered by Alexander Dugin, Vue de Droite under Benoit, very powerful New Right tradition, Vue de Droite in France, and so it goes on. And we mustn't forget the extraordinary contribution to the development of an alternative way of conceptualizing the future fascist revolution, pioneered by Armin Moller in the Conservative Revolution, etc. So there's lots of other fascism to bear in mind when we address this subject. So all this is blah blah for some of you, I'm sure, but it does lead to quite an important salient point. If we are going to use my theory, then one of the first issues I'd really like to stress its use on, my approach, is the rigid demarcation which can be made between radical right-wing populism and fascism. Now, there is, of course, a grey area. There are genuine fascists within the leadership of some radical right-wing populist movements, and there are certainly some fascists who vote radical right-wing populists in elections. But the crucial point is that the fascist myth of radical revolutionary rebirth or palingenesis was a totalizing revolution, cultural, anthropological, political, economic, etc. Populism, even when it's extreme right-wing, stays just about within the parameters of democracy. But of course, the crucial point there is that it can only do so by dropping its liberal democracy. The liberalism of democracy has to be basically dropped or sidelined or reworked, like stressing right to free speech or freedom of thought in a context of justifying extremism a la Marx. So my point is that there has been a great tendency, because of the inflation of the word fascism, for populism to become to somehow be conflated with fascism, whereas I believe that genuine fascists are quite distinct in their aspirations, tactics, and strategies from populism. And of course you can quote the fact that both Mussolini and Hitler both were elected through a democratic system before they became fascist leaders, but I actually believe that I cannot see a single genuine populist leader of the far right, the word far, you could say, is radical right, who actually, male or female, wants to become a leader of a single party state or an autocratic state. I think they're very happy to operate within their own myth of the nation and to exclude those that have been othered from their enjoyment of the rights, the liberal rights of the system that has created a post-war liberal democracy. So the liberalism gets sidelined and elided, but the commitment to democracy stays. And I could list a whole load of populists, but crucially among them, Orban, Trump, Marine Le Pen, Now, if you want a metaphor for this, it's worth reminding ourselves that even though there are examples of trees in Australia that look like European trees, for example, here we've got the Australian eucalyptus regnans and the European mountain ash, when they're examined scientifically, they have a different DNA and a different evolutionary history. So the fact that elements of populist right in its right-wing radical form share common enemies, like a deep antipathy to cultural and ethnic mixing, etc., or anti-socialism, or even anti-Islamophobia and anti-Semitism in some cases. This does not mean that radical right-wing populism is a sort of evolution from an attenuated version of fascism. I see them as genetically different. So when you actually examine in detail radical right-wing populist movements and fascist movements in terms of their nitty-gritty content, ideological, in terms of state organisation, their theories of economy, their theories of race, etc., there really is a big difference. So, for example, at the top we have Mussolini in that fatal period of January 1925, when he was basically announcing the end of democracy, any sort of democracy, not just liberal democracy, and inaugurating the fascist state. And of course, here's Hitler in the triumph of will, Stahl's propaganda, addressing the crowds in a very unparliamentary sort of spirit. Whereas I would contrast this deeply with Trump and Netanyahu, who are actually operating from within the system, and I would actually go as far as to say that even though there must have been a lot of people in the classic attack on the Capitol who wanted Trump to break with liberal democracy and the democratic process, he actually pulled back from not a parliamentary path to fascism, but drew back from any idea of a fascist autocratic state, whatever some of his more fanatical right-wing supporters would hope for. Similarly, Netanyahu has not needed to abolish the Israeli democratic system in order to wage a genocidal war on Gaza. And they operate from within the system still, even though they're bending its legalistic and humanistic framework. Now, if you want a far more authoritative analysis of the right-wing, radical right-wing populism and its relationship to fascism as not even part of the same family, but a different family, no matter how much they are part of, if you like, the same meta-phenomenon of rejection of all sorts of fundamental humanistic values and a form of racist exclusionism, imperialism, etc., then please consult the real expert who should have been here on Thursday, Friday. Casimiro has written some wonderful authoritative stuff about this. So, if you want to move the topic of the talk on a bit, then we can move from other fascisms and other pseudo, but not really fascist, right-wing populist ideas about exclusionism from the fruits of democracy to other theoreticians' fascisms. And of course, here I come back to my point that there's a whole industry, there's several discrete industries of fascist studies. I just happen to become fairly well known in one branch of that. So let's just for a moment pause on the fact that there are other theoreticians about fascisms. I'm afraid my position rejects the left-wing socialist, democratic socialist, communist, Marxist socialist assumptions about the genetic link between capitalism in its last phase and fascism. I'm sorry, but I'm not sorry, actually. I think it's poor scholarship and ultimately an ideological overriding to actually see fascism as essentially a direct product of capitalism in its late phase, or in its defensive phase, or in its most imperialistic phase, or in a phase when it's threatened by the left. It doesn't hold water. I haven't got time to deal with that now, but a recent example of this lingering assumption about the ultimate, very Demotrofian idea that capitalism shows its terroristic nature in fascism, and the Asian theory, etc., is Jeremy Corbyn's hero, most radical part of the Labour Party. I say former Labour Party because he's now left to create his own party. But he wrote a piece in a left-wing journal where he talks about Labour paving the path to fascism because of the hardening of its stance on immigration. Now, to equate anti-immigration with fascism, I'm afraid, is naive. So I'm afraid, if I'm treading on toes of anybody here in your presence, Thursday or Friday, my other person's fascism is not compatible with neo-Marxist ideas about the genetic link between late capitalism, hyper-capitalism and fascism, despite the very obvious case of Musk's appealing to, and Vance for that matter, and Trump for that matter, appealing to right-wing parties like the AFD in their perverted view of the need to defend society, etc., etc. So the extreme left, i.e. the most radical parts of Antifa, and the US left, this is an image from the first regime of Trump, the first administration. The Trump fascist regime must go. This is refusefascism.org. Here's another more recent, smash fascism, etc. I'm afraid, taxonomically, in terms of how we categorize Trumpism, I do believe it's extremely misconceived to see Trumpism as another person's fascism. And there are several academic experts I would take issue with as well. I mean, Robert Paxton initially condemned the idea, dissociated himself from the idea that Trumpism is a form of fascism, but he did change his mind. And I really find no clear, objective, rigorous rationale for him changing his mind. I think if he actually applied his own theory of fascism, which is very much initially influenced by my theory of fascism, which he reworks and rephrases, but it's basically Palin's nationalist, blah blah blah, it doesn't apply to Trump. Trump does not want a revolutionary new order. He wants to destroy the enemies from within and from without, which are making America weak again, but he doesn't want to actually inaugurate a new system. I mean, you need a certain amount of intelligence to even dream up a new system, which I don't think is one of the defining characteristics of Trump. I mean, he's barely literate, let alone capable of being a genuine idealist. I'm afraid I would also take issue, and Jason Stanley knows this because we have been in correspondence about it. I don't want to be cheap by just saying Jason Stanley is not qualified to talk about fascism, because that sounds like cancelling or exclusionism, etc. But I mean, there is a whole branch of fascist comparative studies with hundreds of thousands of hours in aeronautic terms of flying in this discipline, and I'm afraid I find a deep lack of rigor, taxonomically, definitionally, even in terms of historical knowledge, in the way it is assumed in Jason Stanley's works that somehow America is drifting towards fascism. It may be drifting towards autocracy, it may be actively or proactively deliberalizing itself of the core values of liberal democracy and some of its original ideals. So I'm not very happy when people imply that there was a golden age of American liberalism, given the fact that in the American Declaration of Independence, women, children, Native Americans, and slaves are excluded from the category of humanity. So in a way, you can see a lot of Trumpism as a sort of return to early democratic thinking, but it's certainly not fascist in my book. Another person who is part of your conference, our conference, Federico Figura, sounds very right, obviously, another world here. But nevertheless, I do actually, I don't want to simplify his idea, but I actually think there's far more of a caesura, of a break, of what the Italians call strappo, a rupture between historical fascism and modern populism. I mean, populism is fascism adapted to democracy. I'm sure that's a ridiculously simplistic formulation of a much more complicated and nuanced argument, but I really don't go with that. The erect Nazi fascist hand on the right, the saluto romano, or whatever you call it, and the populist fists below, really, I believe, like I said about the Australian trees, are genetically, in terms of their genesis, and generically different. They need a different taxonomic category. I think it's simplistic to see fascism as somehow morphing or mutating into populism, because there are still genuine fascists, but the climate in which they attempt to thrive has changed so much. They are extremely marginalised and cause there's no equivalent of the 500,000 members of the SA now in uniformed supporters of a fascist leader. So they are driven into extreme acts of lone actor terrorist attacks and extremist books, but they cannot get a movement off the ground because fascism is radically discredited by the Holocaust and the Second World War, but also the conditions of prosperity and stability, despite all the wars and things, are so incomparable in even now the collapse of the whole system and the imminent ecological catastrophe. The standard of living is absolutely comparable for the vast majority compared with the interwar period. So the conditions are there. I just see right-wing populism as having a very different genesis and appeal. So when we learn that the assassin of Charles Kerr inscribed on one of the bullet casings, "Hey fascist cat," I think it's a very deep but significant miscategorization of what something like Charles Kirk is. I mean, an apologist, are very articulate and in terms of rhetorical powers and argumentative skills and rhetoric, very powerful advocate of a Trumpian populist simplicity in the analysis of what's wrong with society, but a very long way from fascism. Incidentally, it was only when I started researching this bit of my talk that I came across this wonderful idea, wonderful in the sense of terrifying, the idea of black pilling, and I point to the article there, published in the independent newspaper in Britain, talking about the idea of not a red pill which makes you unable to see reality as it is, but black pilling, which seems to be like a formula for anarchy and mayhem in a sort of positive nihilistic and Nietzschean terms, despair about the state of the world and the absence of any higher truth. The fact that Bella Ciao, the Marxist song of the Italian partisan movement against Nazism, was inscribed in another book, it would lend some sort of credence to the idea that it would be ridiculous to talk about Thailand being some sort of having a theory of fascism or having another fascism. I mean, this is a product of utter taxonomic confusion and superficiality, which is typical of the internet age. Incidentally, note the equivalent taxonomic distortion of demonization at work in Trump's reciprocally simplistic and fanatical mindset when he officially banned Antifa, not for its extremist fringe, which obviously resorts to undemocratic means or rhetoric or hate rhetoric in order to make its point, but as a domestic terrorist movement, because it aligns in the acts and the language of people like Vance, Musk, and Trump with the demonization of the left, so that there is a sort of slippage between demonizing or attacking the violent anti-fascist left, right over to the humanistic values of an American university such as Harvard. And there is this sort of demonization and indiscriminate lumping together of the left as a sort of threat to society, hence the war on woke, and hence the attempt to delegitimize scientifically founded alarm about the environment and the state of the planet ecologically with left-wing, woke, liberal, windy, unpatriotic, crypto-communist attacks on civilization and progress. I mean, it's just scary. So what I really redirect the attention of the conference towards is away from the obsessive preoccupation with the return of fascism or the proliferation of new fascisms or other fascisms or other people's fascisms, which has been generated by liberal and socialists for all I know, Christian, Hindu, Buddhist or whatever, humanist, anti-fascist, and towards too much, for me, much more serious threats to the Western humanistic civilization, which I think are insufficiently concentrated on because of this excessive preoccupation with the return of fascism. And the first of these is autocracy, neo-autocracy, you could call it, but it's not the autocracy of the interwar period of the 19th century. And the other is, we've met it before, radical right-wing populism. First of all, the concern with fascism and the, I think, sterile debates about whether Putin or Trump or Xi Jinping or whatever are fascists deflects intelligent preoccupation by journalists and academics and politicians and the general public with the rise of very powerful and terrifyingly anti-human forms of neo-autocracy, some of which can form temporary cynical alliances, as happened quite recently with the leaders of China, North Korea and Russia, all have been being bonded together at the commemoration of the end of the Second World War in China, through their shared enemies, the enemies of Western civilization, Trump, humanism, liberal democracy, freedom of speech, etc., etc.
So that is, I think, where the tape ends. And what I would suggest is we gather questions. Not necessarily now, because there will be a session tomorrow morning for those of you who'd like to come half an hour early. And Professor Griffin has agreed to be here live on a link.
As for radical right-wing populism, it seems to me that populism, fascism, and whether it's fascist or not, or whether it's even democratic or not, we really should focus on the fact that there's radical right-wing populism in its very different national permutations and dialects has already chalked up a whole load of really terrible acts of inhumanity, the state terror against drug cartels in the Philippines, Hungarian and Slovak support for Putin, which has fueled division in Europe over Ukraine, division and state Islamophobia of India due to Modi's BJP, a Hindu version of populism, genocidal destruction in Gaza by a democratically elected politician backed by a right-wing coalition of extreme religious fanatics and extreme secular fanatics of Israeli nationalism and xenophobes, Islamophobes, a most catastrophic, slowly unfolding genocidal catastrophe, not carried out by fascists, not by fascists. That's what makes it so disturbing. We shouldn't be worried about whether it's fascist or not. Look what an elected head of state brought to power on a circumscribed term under democratic rules can do with the power of the army and power of the media and power gained over the judicial process. And of course, America, Trump for me is terrifying in a number of ways, but his support for Netanyahu, the refusal of American presidents to use their economic and military power of support for Israel and to actually use it as leverage to stop this slow motion genocide is, for me, a terrifying indictment of radical right-wing populism, which of course is a spectrum between moderate and radical and extreme. And in a way, if there ever is going to be a continuing human history, almost as disturbing, but on the scale of human lives, more disturbing, is the subsumption into radical right-wing populism of climate skepticism. The reversal of policies to save the biosphere, the denial, the negationism of the idea that there is any problem and that it's all some liberal, left-wing, pseudo-academic, wokey people who are feeding the hysteria is really, really, for me, a far greater threat than any residue of fascism. And just 3 out of thousands. I mean, there's so much literature that I would invoke if I had to turn this into a statement, which I don't worry I wouldn't. Far too old and unexpert. But the global rise of autocracy and its threat to a sustainable future is well known. Yeah. Religions and the global rise of civilizational populism, yes. The dismantling of democracy and the Orbanization of Hungary, yes. These people, these academics are capturing something without being waylaid and misled by an obsession with fascism. So my little contribution to understanding what's going on is really a new term, won't catch on, but I'm going to give it to you anyway because I like it. And it's incurvation, a new generic term for political analysis. In the 4th century AD, St. Augustine, 4th century, actually didn't prove to read very well, identified a particular pathology of Christian faith, the state of being incurvatus in se, curved or bent or turned in on oneself, self-absorbed, solipsistic, rather than serving God and others. Martin Luther picked this phrase up from St. Augustine to describe the human tendency to lose the capacity for compassion for fellow humanity and the faith in God's love, while hypocritically and arrogantly asserting the soundness of their Christian belief. Now, obviously, we're now living in a, if you like, post-religious, not for everybody, world, but in the contemporary world, the equivalent of being incurved or of being gripped by incurvation is a deepening, against the background of a deepening objective and subjective economic, personal and civilizational crisis, is a spread of anomaly, of a loss of compass, a loss of direction, a loss of purpose, a loss of a sense of stable self and value, which is breeding this state of incurvation, what I call selective empathy towards your kind, and the suspension of empathy between their kind. Now, this construction of us and them is ultimately a form of Manichaeanism, of the division of the world into good and bad, deeply mythical. It creates a pseudo-humanism towards your kind and a dehumanization of the other kind, which makes it, if we go back to etymology, unkind. There is a deep etymologically. And if you took a Martian perspective of the contemporary politics, you would see that what links what's going on in toxic democracies under the influence of right-wing populism and what's going on in autocracies such as China when they persecute Uyghurs, etc., or what's happening in North Korea in this obsession with having the power to wipe out all its neighbours, or what's happening in Putin's Russia. What they all share is incurvation, the exclusion from the idea of the world, of humanity, of what is beautiful, what is good, what is to be empathized with, of vast sections of humanity, incurvation. Now, it's only after I got to this concept I found out that in 2015 there was it actually made the concept, Luther's use of it, made the front cover of the New Yorker, didn't really seem to have any resonance. But it's interesting that the opening paragraph of the New Yorker article, My Modifications Are in Gold, is a citation from Martin Luther. Our nature, by the corruption of the first sin, being so deeply curved in on itself, that incurvatus instead, that it not only bends the best, i.e. the humanistic, in my terms, gifts of democratic power, Luther said God, towards itself and enjoys them, as is plain in the works righteous and hypocrite, or rather even uses God himself, democracy, in order to attain these gifts, but also fails to realize that it so wickedly, curvedly, and viciously seeks all things, even God, democratic power, for its own sake. I mean, it's all a bit crowded, that thought. But basically, incurvation means that there's a process of grandiosity, of grandiosization on the part of the ruling elite or the leader. There's the appeal to the chosen people, the special people, the real human beings, the real Americans, the real Hungarians or whatever. There's the dehumanization and demonization of the others. And the migrant for somebody who is incurved like Farage and some of his more extreme right-wing henchmen become things to allow to drown in the channel in order to live out the fruits of their legality. So I've offered a working definition here. not a place to start. Incurvation is a political concept. The increasing withdrawal into ethically, politically, ideologically demarcated and deeply mythicized home, accompanied by climate denial and proactive anti-liberalism and the Manichaean demonization of the other, constructed by various conspiracy theories and simplistic socio-political analysis, which undermine globalized forms of humanism, international cooperation, and transcultural idealism. And I believe that incurvation, which of course subsumes fascism very much, but fascism becomes only one manifestation or permutation of incurvation, is what is really to be frightened of today. Why? Why is this happening? Well, I'm going to give you a very, very simplistic initial response. Globalized enemy spread by modernization and concomitant secularization. That's really sort of neo-Durkheiminism. The erosion of the sacred canopy. You'd have to tune into Peter Berger for that. The fatal flaw of human nature that it cannot stand very much reality, with all its infinite, multifaceted complexity, and thus takes refuge in simplification and mythic fantasy. In other words, most ordinary people, I'm afraid, and I don't feel superior to this because I'm paid to live off complexity and try to sort it out conceptually, cannot stand the complexity and unintelligibility of the world and are seduced by myth. And some nuggets of insight from people far more creative and intelligent than me. This life's dim windows of the soul distorts the heavens from pole to pole and leads you to believe a lie when you see with, not through the eye. Go, go, said the bird. Humankind cannot bear very much reality. The problem is not seeing what we do not want to see, the state of willful blindness. So, what do? We have a conference in Potsdam. We all presumably, unless we're undercover agents for some neo-Trumpist psycho, are in some form or other liberal humanists, religious humanists, communist humanists. Well, I quote P.S. Eliot from another poem, and there is only the fight to recover what has been lost and found and lost again and again, and now under conditions that seem unpropitious, but perhaps neither gain nor loss. For us, there is only the trying, the rest is not our business. If that sounds rather pathetic, reflection on what we're doing by even holding conferences like this when we can, then I'm pushing 80, and that probably reflects my sense of impotence to do much of anything really, which comes up whenever I try to take stock of what I've actually achieved, which is very, very little. In other words, as global humanists, secular or religious, our deontic duty is to resist, as in the darkest days of state fascism and Nazism of the 1930s, that's BNS, and the 1940s, and for academics and their institutions, whatever their definition of fascism, to stand strong in defense of universal, social, liberal, democratic, and human values, Trump will pass. So we have to stand firm, and it's very inconvenient, and we might threaten our jobs, etc. But I do believe that there may be pushback. There may be pushback eventually. In pragmatic terms, this might at least serve in a minute way to keep an underground humanist tradition alive, and by humanist I mean religious or secular, in case an age of neo-humanism, neo-enlightenment, either religious or secular, breaks in both religious and secular societies in response to the imminent death of the planet and civilized humane society. Or perhaps because it is simply integral to our instinctive, existential, visceral mission in life, and we know no other way. Or as Bill put it, and I trying to harmonise with songs the lonesome sparrow sings. Well, nothing I've said today is worth a couple of lines of a Bob Dylan song at its best, but that's what I'm trying to do.
That's for you.
To feed my own sense of existential clarity in conditions which are steadily more unpropitious. But rather than end with me, I'd like to end with Primo Levi. In 1963, he published a text called La Tregua, which means the truce in Italian, translated as the reawakening. And I think, given what's going on in the world, in its deepening state of incurvation, maybe what he says about the new fascism could, even though I'm saying it's not really fascism, I think it can be subsumed within incurvation, neo-autocracy, and radical and extreme right-wing populism. And this is what he said. In every part of the world, wherever you begin by denying fundamental liberties of mankind, we say humankind now, and equality among people, you move towards the concentration camp system, and it is a road on which it is difficult to walk. A new fascism, with its trail of intolerance, of abuse, and of servitude, can be born outside our country and be imported into it, walking on tiptoe and calling itself by other names. No. Or it can loose itself from within with such violence that it rounds all defences. At that point, wise counsel no longer serves, and one must find the strength to resist. And at that point, academic lectures like me at a conference are really not very useful. But I hope that I have pushed minds and feelings towards the idea of a sort of humanistic resistance fueled by the encounters that you will have with Potsdam in the next few days, and which I would love to have joined, but I've got my own little humanistic battle going on in my own family, and I have been forced not to be present. I look forward to any responses that I can engage with on Friday morning. Hopefully the Wi-Fi in the hotel room will be working, and we can at least meet virtually for a few minutes. And I thank the Einstein Forum very much for